Nearly everything. First of all, let's speak about Prosecco. Prosecco is coming from the northeast of Italy. It is not Italy's sparkling wine. It has to come from a specific area in Veneto or Friuli Venezia Giulia. It is also coming from the Glera grape varietal, at least 85% will have to. And it's made in a method called the Charmat method generally. That said, it's not a requirement. It can also be made in the method champenoise, or it can be made col fondo, as we say in Italy, which is a spontaneous re-fermentation in the bottle. But the important thing is that it is a wine, you can make this wine very quickly, a matter of a few months, and it's a wine that's meant to be drank immediately. Yes, some can last a couple of years, but generally speaking, you're going to want to drink them right away. When we are speaking of Champagne, we are speaking of a wine from France, but more specifically, we are speaking of a wine that comes directly from Champagne, which is a designated area in the north of France. This is a wine that is made in a completely different style. It's called the method champenoise, where the secondary fermentation is going to happen directly in the bottle instead of these pressurized steel tanks that often Prosecco is made of. It's a wine that also takes a minimum of 16 months in Champagne to make, or speaking of even 36 months for a wine that's coming as a Reserva wine for Champagne. And we actually have, what's interesting in Italy is a wine called Franciacorta. This is coming from just east of Milan, and it's a region that's dedicated to making wines very similar to Champagne. So we're speaking of the method champenoise and similar grapes, Pinot Nero, Pinot Bianco, and such that you make the wines from. Champagne, of course, can even last sometimes decades when they are good years and good producers. Anyways, Prosecco can be fun. It's sweeter, of course, it's lighter, it's easier, it's more approachable for many people, especially for younger palates, whereas Champagne maybe does require a slightly more appreciation of wine because it often is going to be a bit more dry. But it is a wine that is also meant for dinners, whereas Prosecco is going to be a wine that you're going to use more for an aperitivo, or as we would use for a spritz in Italy. Sulfites are in wine because they are a microbial killer and they act as a preservative. Wines that are going to be shipped for long distances, especially on a boat for potentially 2 months, need a little bit of extra protection. The biggest culprit of who is adding sulfites to wine are the big producers. When winemakers are making millions or hundreds of millions of bottles per year that are destined for supermarket shelves, they need every single bottle to taste the exact same, because you as a consumer, when you're buying Yellowtail or Robert Mondavi, you want to know exactly what you're going to get in that bottle, because of course you don't get to try wine before you buy it. And this is a way to control the aromas, because microbial activity, which are yeasts and things that are naturally can be kind of occurring in the air, can make a wine taste different. So in one corner, if there's perhaps some different yeast, they can make a wine taste differently. And this is a way to kill them. The reality is it's also killing the life of the wine. So for me, I don't want a wine that has many sulfites in it. Of course, they're also something that can give you headaches in the wine. You'll always see it on the ingredient list. There is no ingredient list on wine. You're gonna always see contained sulfites though, because by law, since there is 1% of the population that does have the true allergy, they do require it. But the reality is that every wine naturally also occurs with about 15 to 25 parts per million of naturally occurring sulfite. The problem is that they can add a lot more. You can add up to 350 parts per million legally, I know, into the US wines, and it's okay. Organic wines in the US by law cannot have sulfites added, but in the EU, if you are making an organic wine, there is a small amount of sulfites that are allowed to be in. The issue, guys, is not the sulfites. The issue is when we are speaking of wines made in the multi-millions. So just avoid supermarket wines if you don't want to have sulfites. Also, wines that are imported from Italy that go to the US, by law, have to actually have a small amount of sulfites added for the COLA labeling requirements. I will tell you though that we are lucky as the Roscioli Wine Club, we are able to do private shipping, so the wines do not go through the same importation process, meaning that they are just privately shipped from Italy directly to your home. They have no added sulfites. First of all, everyone likes to blame sulfites for their headaches in wine, and that's because every bottle usually will say contains sulfites, and so because that's the only ingredient you see on the list, there is no ingredient list you might notice on wines, you blame that as the consumer. The reality is only about 1% of the population actually has a true sulfite allergy that can cause severe reactions. There are 74 approved additives that can go into wine, and because there's no ingredient list, you'll never know what they are, so there could be a ton of other things. One other thing, guys, don't forget, there's a thing called alcohol in all these wines. If you drink too much of it, of course, you're going to naturally get dehydrated and have a headache in the morning. The other thing too, histamines are actually higher in wines that are lower in sulfites. And a lot of the population, like myself, actually has a histamine allergy. So for me, the reason I have a nasal problem or a congestion problem in the morning is from the histamines in the wine. Italy is a complex, beautiful mess in terms of wine. We have nearly 1,800 different grape varietals. You're probably mainly used to knowing Cabernet, Merlot, Chardonnay, Sauvignon Blanc, Pinot Noir, a few other ones. And so this makes it extremely challenging. Also because in the old world, so we're speaking of Spain, France, Italy, these type of places, we are going to call a wine by often the name of a place. And even if we do call it by the name of a grape, even the place is often attached to it, so it's Barbera d'Alba. If you come from the US, of course, you are used to the wines being labeled as Cabernet, Merlot, Chardonnay. And this was actually done in the 70s because Americans were not drinking wines because they were unfamiliar with these European wines. And so they decided to start to make it more approachable. It's much easier to memorize the name of 10 different grape varietals than it is to memorize 12,000 different places. And so when you saw Cabernet, you became familiar with it. Cabernet essentially became the brand, almost more so than even Mondavi or calling it by the actual name of the producer. Here in Italy though, you will often see a wine like, for example, Barolo. It is the most important thing that is on the wine label. It's the most prominent word you're gonna see. Below that, you might even see the name of the actual crew, where it's coming from. And then sometimes in smaller letters down below, you're gonna see who actually made it. But for us, most often the place is what gives the flavors of the wine. So does it matter that Chianti is made from Sangiovese? Sure, it's nice to know it, but you have to understand that Chianti is more important than the grape Sangiovese. If you were to plant Sangiovese, for example, where you plant Nebbiolo in Barolo, it's going to taste completely different. The nicest thing is that when you're in Italy, the easiest thing you can do is just drink local. So naturally, what is coming from a specific region in terms of wine will often pair perfectly with the regional cuisine. And that's because these wines and foods have been naturally selected to go together over hundreds, if not thousands of years. So when you're here, please don't ask for Cabernet, Merlot, Chardonnay, Sauvignon Blanc. These are French grape varietals, and Italians love to show off their local traditions and heritage. Many of these grapes have been saved. We have nearly 350 indigenous grape varietals that were born here and that are still here today. To give you an idea, most New World countries have a maximum of 100 to 150 grape varietals, and Italians love to show off these local grape varietals because they've preserved them for so long. So when you are here, just drink local and get lost in the beauty of Italian wine. In Italy, we have our classification system, which is the DOC, DOCG. These are wines coming from a designated origin, so denominazione di origine controllata, or the G adds the word garantita, meaning that the Italian government will actually taste these wines to make sure that they are of a certain level of quality before they are allowed to go to the market. And this means basically that these wines have specific rules. To be called Chianti, you have to follow a set of rules. The wine has to age for a certain amount of months before it can go to the market. There are certain vessels, whether it can be aged in wood or steel, things like that will be required of the wines. There's also, of course, the Vino da Tavola, and this is a wine that basically has no rules. That said, unfortunately in Italy, we deal with a lot of corruption, and it can simply be a matter of a payoff that someone who was outside of the original DOCG zone or DOC zone gets added into it. And so often these wines lack a little bit of the scruples that AOC system has. Those wines are a little bit more guaranteed to be of a certain quality. The other thing to consider is that Sassicaia, if any of you know it, it's a wine that is about $500 a bottle these days, started off as a Vino da Tavola because it just chose to not follow the rules. And in the 70s, the DOC system was mainly invented as a pushback to how bad the wine quality had turned in the 1950s. And it is so important to Italy's tourism and to the finances of the country that the government stepped in and said, okay, we need to put some quality and rules behind the wine to make sure that it's at a certain level. But that also froze how the wine could be made. You couldn't experiment. And in the 70s, there was a lot of international success with the wines coming from Napa Valley. And a lot of the winemakers here wanted to start to play with this, and that's where Sassicaia was born. So because it was not following the rules of the Tuscan wines to be labeled as a DOC or a DOCG, they had to call it a Vino da Tavola. Fortunately, the government had noticed that this wine was gaining fame and gaining success, costing a lot more money, and they ended up creating what's called the IGT system in 1992, and that's a wine that's coming from an indicated geographical territory that's not following the rules. And so that's also what you might know as a super Tuscan. Those are kind of your IGT wines. But guys, just know that theoretically, yes, a wine labeled as a DOCG should technically be of better quality, but do not get stuck on the idea that if a wine doesn't have a DOC or a DOCG label, that it's not a good wine. Super Tuscans, they are a wine coming from a geographical territory, so we are speaking of Tuscany, that are not made with the indigenous grapes that are required to be in the wines for DOC and DOCG wines, as we were speaking about before. You might know these wines if you know Sassicaia, or Ornellaia, Solaia, all the aya, that's our word that we like to say in Italy. Certainly these wines, also being called Super Tuscans, do not sound very Italian. They are mainly using the French grape varietals like Cabernet, Merlot, Syrah, and they were the grape varietals that had international success in Napa Valley and all around the world throughout the 70s. The reason that these wines have become so popular is that they are familiar to you, especially the Americans when they come. If you see a Vino Nobile da Montepulciano and you see a Cabernet, which one do you generally go for? You're going to go for Cabernet because you know it, because you're familiar with it. We have a cognitive bias that says that we generally like things that are familiar to us. And that flavor profile is also very familiar. So when you're drinking a Cabernet or a Merlot, you feel comfortable. If you're drinking a wine that's made from Sangiovese, you might not be as familiar with it in terms of your palate. It's going to be more acidic. It's going to want food around to be enjoyed. And so sometimes we'll say, I don't like it. But know that these Super Tuscan wines are just not very Italian. And so when you are in the region of Tuscany, be careful of what you're saying about them if you love Super Tuscans, because a lot of the traditionalists in this region don't really like the concept of all these French grapes infiltrating their area when they've been making quality wines like Vino Nobile da Montepulciano for well over 1,000 years. An orange wine is not a wine made from oranges. No, the name comes from the color of the wine, which you see here. It's more of a golden color, and that's why they're called orange wines. So why does the wine turn this color? It's basically a white wine made in the style of a red wine. The skins of the grapes are more of a golden color, and since the wine will spend time with the skins, that color gets absorbed into the wine. The other thing that gets absorbed are the tannins from the skins, and this makes these white wines taste more almost like a red wine, not in the exact flavor profiles, but the textural feeling on your palate. These are also wines that really want to have food around, and the beautiful thing is that they pair with nearly everything. Some people also wonder, are orange wines a new thing? No, these are wines that technically have been being made as far back as 9,000 years ago when wine was being made in Georgia. Oh, corked wine, what are you looking for? So usually when we do this whole routine of smelling cork, you're gonna smell sometimes something that smells very like mildewy, musty, wet, newspapers, damp kind of mildewy smells. It comes from a fungus that when it comes into contact with different chlorides or bleach products, it can create what's called 2,4,6-TCA, and that gives these kind of off-putting aromas. The wine is actually fine in terms of if you drink it, nothing's going to happen to you, but the wine won't show all of its fullness and its brightness and its vibrancy, and oftentimes it's actually undrinkable. Sometimes it can be very, very subtle, and other times it can be, it literally just hits you in the face like a ton of bricks and knocks your socks off completely. But it is only from a wine that has a cork. If you have a wine with a screw cap, you cannot have a corked wine. Along the lines of how long a wine can last for is the idea of should I decant or should I not? The reality is in restaurants, the reason they're decanting is because they don't have the ability to open up a wine a couple of hours in advance. When you're there, you order a wine, you need to be able to drink it right away. And some of these wines need a little extra exposure to oxygen to properly open up. The thing is oxygen is the enemy of wine. When wines get exposed to too much oxygen, they fall apart. So be careful. If you are decanting at home, know that if you are going to pour the entire bottle bottle into the decanter, often that wine will need to be drank immediately that night. It's not going to last another day because it got too much exposure to oxygen. Usually decanting, why you want to do it is because you're going to separate the sediment that can fall out of suspension in the wines, and so that you're not pouring that sediment into into people's glasses, because that's not often a fun thing to have for the last sip of the wine. I would say decanting really doesn't need to be done in general unless the wine does have a lot of sediment. Usually all you need to do is open the bottle, pour a little bit out so that the wine gets to about this level, leave it open for a couple of hours, and that'll give it all the oxygen it needs. And just swirl the wine around in the glass. That'll also help to give it a little extra more oxygen. People love to ask how long wine can stay open for. It really depends. First of all, white wines you will often keep in the refrigerator, so this is also going to help them to stay for longer. They can usually go 5, 6, 7 days is no problem. Whereas a red wine, usually you're not going to store in the refrigerator. You technically could put it in there, but be very careful when you take it out that you're not doing anything aggressive to warm it up. You're just going to want to leave it out for several hours. Red wines often, if they are more fruity, are going to fall apart more quickly because when the fruit goes away, if there's no backbone with acidity and tannins or higher alcohol, there's nothing left in the wine and it kind of almost can turn into vinegar. That said, a wine more like Barolo or Barbaresco, you might know, which has more tannins and more structure to it, higher acidity, more power, those wines have a little bit more that can slowly fall away over time. And those wines we can find sometimes even last 3 days without any problem. Natural wines you might think don't last very long because they are usually not going to have sulfites in them. And so a lot of people will think that these wines will kind of spoil quicker. Ironically, we've had wines that are natural wines that can be open for a couple of weeks and even are good. So this whole thing, there is no exact science to it. You'll just have to learn and experiment, but there are different things that you can do to help make the wine last longer. There's a product called a vacuvin, which you put kind of like a fake cork where you pull out the oxygen. There's even the coravin, of course, which allows you to not even open the bottle of wine. It's a needle that's going to go in and put an argon gas, a layer of that, which is going to be an inert gas that keeps the wine from ever experiencing any contact with oxygen. That said, that one costs a lot more money, so unless you are a serious collector, I wouldn't probably recommend it.